Today we're taking a look at Morpheus Forms. Forms is a feature available in Morpheus version 6.1.0 and higher, and it's designed to make the creation of catalog items simpler, while also allowing for more complex configurations such as multi-disk deployments, more customizable network layouts, and more. To understand the benefits of the form builder, let's first take a look at how catalog items were built previously, and they can still be built this way today. But if we take a look at a pre-existing catalog item, the way that these were created, this is an instance type catalog item, is we would come in here and click the configure button. And once you click the configure button, you get the very familiar instance provisioning wizard that familiar users with Morpheus have seen many times. So once you complete the instance provisioning wizard, Morpheus is going to give you the JSON map that represents the instance that you just configured. This is going to include all the static configurations that you just set, such as the group, the cloud, things of that nature. And if you wanted to give your users some customizability over the catalog item, you would use the Morpheus concept of inputs to allow the user to provide the input that they needed to customize that catalog item. And inputs take the form of simple data entry concepts that anyone would be familiar with from using other web pages. So these can be text fields, these can be passwords, they can be select lists, checkboxes, radio buttons, things like that. So very simple concepts that any user of the web would be familiar with. There were some powerful ways that we could source things like select lists and type ahead fields and things of that nature, but from the user's perspective, it was simple text entry. And this was still very powerful, and our customers did create some incredible templates that were easy for end users to deploy. But one limitation was that it required a pretty significant knowledge of this JSON payload in order to be most effective. And also there were some limitations just simply due to the types of inputs that you could take. There were text fields, but we didn't have more complex entry fields such as disk configuration fields or network configuration fields, and we can do things like that with forms. So now that we've taken a look at creating catalog items using inputs, let's take a look at forms and how those can be used to make creating catalog items easier and more powerful. So forms are created in the library section, and within the options subsection, you'll see that there's a tab labeled forms that's alongside the inputs and options list tabs, which have been there. And if we're creating a new form, there's really two main constructs that you're adding at any given time. You're either adding an input or you're adding a field group. Field groups are logical collections of inputs. So you'll see when I clicked add field group there, it went ahead and added the field group. And if I click on the edit button, I can give it a name if I wanted to, my field group. And you have some basic options here. We can add a description. We can make the field group collapsible if we want to. You'll see when I clicked on that, it added this character symbol here out to the left of the field group. That's to indicate that this is collapsible. And we can also choose if it is expanded or collapsed by default. So if you had a group of, let's say you had a group of advanced options, you may want that to be collapsed by default because only your advanced users are going to need to be able to see that at all. We can also set a visibility field, which is just like setting a visibility field on an input, which we've been able to do in the past. That will say that if an input with a certain field name has a value added to it, then this field group will then become visible. And unless the user fills in a certain input, this field group will remain invisible. So we do have the option to do that. You'll also notice when I started to add a field group, I have a new add input button here. So if we add input up here, that's going to add an input that is outside of any of the field groups. If we add an input here, we're going to be adding an input within the field group. You'll see if I add more, then I have additional add input buttons, and I can fill my inputs into the field groups that way. Let's go ahead and close our new form now, though, and take a look at one that's already created. And I can point out from there some of the great features of catalog item forms. So if we go into here, you'll see that this form has field groups. We have one for the placement of the instance being provisioned, the group, the cloud, the resource pool, as well as the size. So that's choosing the layout and plan, that's selecting the disk size, things of that nature. And then we also have an additional configuration section. You can see that the caret is pointing to the right on this one. That indicates that this is collapsed by default. And that's because not every user is going to need to add additional tags. So that is an advanced option, you could say, or just an additional configuration option. And only certain users are going to need that at all. So I'm collapsing that by default. Now let's go ahead and add an input just to see some of the options that we have when doing that. One thing that I will point out is we have the option to use an existing input or not use an existing input. And if we say yes, that's going to allow us to select any input that's pre-existing within the Morpheus appliance. So those are the inputs that are created within the inputs section, library options, inputs. So anything that you have previously, you wouldn't need to rebuild in order to use it in a form. If I click on, I can use the search through the type ahead field, or I can click on this button and I can select a input that is pre-existing within this appliance, and I could use it in my form if I wanted to. You'll see that that is automatically going to fill in these configuration fields for the form. We can't edit that here. We would have to go into the input section if we did want to edit that, but it is going to show us the configuration, which can help us decide if this input is going to be the appropriate one. But probably more often than not, you're going to be creating a new input, especially at first as you're getting started creating catalog items. So if I say no, now I am able to configure a new input. So if I open up the type, this is probably the most important selection because it determines the behavior of the input as well as all of the other configuration options that come after it. I won't go through every single one of these types because a lot of them will be familiar to anyone who has already used the inputs concept before. And there are also just a lot of them and would make the video very long, but all of these are fully documented in Morpheus docs. So if you go to docs.morpheusdata.com, there's a full write-up on creating forms there, including a reference to each of the form types and what you can expect from that type. And then also within the catalog items section, there is additional documentation content there as well for turning your forms into catalog items that are usable. But taking a look back at the type, as I said, for those who are familiar with Morpheus, you'll notice that these basic types of inputs are familiar to the types of inputs we were able to create previously: select lists, checkboxes, text areas, text boxes. I won't go too deep into that because they are very familiar to anyone who's been using Morpheus for a little while. The advanced section, though, are new. In a lot of ways, these are pretty similar to basic, but in some way, they give you some kind of data manipulation capability or some sort of special capability. So if we did a key value, that's going to give us a special box that allows us to enter in a key and a value. We also get this plus button so the user can add as many key and value pairs as they would like. We have the code editor, so maybe if your user needs to give some kind of configuration in a JSON format, maybe you want to allow them to give you a provisioning script of some kind and they need to enter some shell commands. You can allow them to use a code editor, and Morpheus even allows you to select the type of highlighting that you want for when the user is filling it in, which is very convenient. So like if this was JSON configuration, you'll see at this point it's telling me that I don't have correct JSON syntax in there, but if I start typing, it'll say, okay, now this is correct. If I begin typing a key pair of some kind, you'll notice that value. You'll see that now that I have valid JSON, that red circle has gone away. If I were to add a comma but not add another key value pair, it would warn me once again. So we have some very handy syntax highlighting if you want to use the code editor, but each of these advanced types of inputs is going to give you some kind of data manipulation or special use case in some way or another. But perhaps the most powerful additional input type for forms are the ones that are in these provisioning sections. So you're going to notice that these are Morpheus provisioning concepts. You'll see group, you'll see cloud, you'll see resource pool, plan, layout, instance type, things that you're familiar with if you've used Morpheus for a while. But you'll notice that if we click on group, let's say, and actually instead of using this new group field that I'm creating, let's actually take a look at the one that's existing down here. For group, that's kind of at the top of the chain in terms of filtering when creating an instance within Morpheus. You're going to set the group, and that's going to determine which clouds that you can select, etc., etc. So groups is at the top of the chain, but if we take a look at the cloud input, if I scroll down past some of these configurations here at the bottom, you'll see that I do need to tell it which group field this cloud field should cascade off of. And mine just happens to be labeled group. So all that I've entered here is group, and that is going to link it to this field above. And that's indicating that this cloud field should reload and refilter based on what is set in this group field. So all of these things that you might have had to do manually in the past, creating inputs that are going to be giving the correct group options and giving the correct cloud options, etc., depending on what is set in the prior fields. All of that now comes baked in and makes it much easier. If we look at resource pool and scroll down, you'll see that that's dependent not only on group like the cloud was, that's dependent on a group, a cloud, a layout, and a plan field. And all of that refiltering and reloading is now baked right in. So that is really one of the key powers to forms, is having access to these provisioning fields. So if you want to be able to make reusable catalog input forms that are going to allow your users to select a group, select a cloud, select a layout and plan, and set their disk size and choose a specific network and things like that, this is now much, much easier and more reusable to be able to do through forms rather than through inputs. So we've created the form, and now we need to connect that to a catalog item. If I close my form modal, we'll go into the library blueprints section, and then from there we'll go into the catalog items section. Now I've already set up a catalog item that is associated with this form, so let's take a look at that. I've done some of the basic configuration here. Now the main thing that I want to point out is I've created the instance map. I've done that by clicking this configure button, and then when you do that you go through the very familiar instance provisioning wizard, and at the end of the day that's going to give you the JSON map that represents the instance configuration. Now in the past, we would set the inputs down here, but as of 6.1.0, we now have the option to base the catalog item on either a form or based on inputs. If we do inputs, that's going to be just as we were always able to create catalog items before, but forms is the new option. And rather than having to select lots of inputs, we simply select one form. And in this case, it's the form that I've already created. So going back up here, we now need to, we now have the static JSON map for the instance, but we need to get the dynamic content in there in order to allow users to make their selections at provision time. So in the past, what we would need to do for a lot of these sections like group or cloud or plan is we would need to actually make reference to our input variables at various points in this instance map. And that worked fine, but it required a knowledge of the instance map and a knowledge of the exact data types that you were getting out of your variables, and may require a little bit of trial and error, among other things, to get it exactly right. But forms give us some nice advantages that actually make this much easier. You'll notice that in this catalog item, I haven't overridden any of the static settings for a lot of these sections that were set when I went through the instance configuration wizard. If I was using just inputs, this group, for instance, I would have to override with a variable call if I wanted this to be dynamic, but you can see that it is still the same static information that I've had before. And that's one of the key advantages of using forms. If you'll look over here, once I associate my form, then I get this form variables sidebar, and that's going to show me all of the variables that are available from the inputs that reside on my form. And one of those is groups. So if we click this little down arrow here, you'll see that it has this option for auto inject. And all of these form variables that have the expandable section there are containing auto inject inside there. And what that does is Morpheus is able to automatically inject anything that was configured on the group input on the form into the correct space within the instance map. So I've lost my place here a minute, but if I find the group section again, here it is. This can be automatically injected by using that provisioning type of instance labeled group on my form. I don't have to override any of the static configuration. Same thing with plan, same thing with cloud, same thing with network and disk, and any of these that automatically are able to auto inject. So that alone is going to speed up your catalog item creation tremendously, and you're going to be able to have all kinds of flexibility that you would have had to program in yourself previously when using just inputs. So being able to auto inject those variables, you'll see that I didn't have to change anything about my static configuration here for plan. I know that my plan is going to be auto injected. Now, if you have other inputs that aren't of the provisioning type, those you will still seed into your instance map where required. But Morpheus does now allow you to click and drag these form variables into your configuration map. So this isn't the correct space for this, but let's say that my plan ID was supposed to be injected here rather than this static false configuration. What I can do is just backspace that, and I can actually just drag this right on top, and it's automatically going to give me that variable call. So I don't have to type the syntax. I don't have to remember what the field name was, which sometimes could be a bit of a pain if you had to go back to your instance, to your inputs over and over to remember exactly what you set as the field name. That is automatically going to add that variable call in for you. So many of them will now be auto-injected, and the ones that aren't, you can actually just click and drag into the space, and it makes building the catalog items much, much simpler. So that's a look at creating catalog items using forms, but there's one additional feature I do want to point out before we leave here, and that is the logo option. Now this has been there for a while. Morpheus had a list of pre-installed logos. You could use those for more generic instance types, and it also allowed you to do a custom upload, which would let you browse the local computer for a logo that might be currently residing on that computer. But what is new is the ability to use a logo generator. So in the past, if you didn't set a logo, Morpheus would use this default resource logo, and that was fine except in situations where you had very large catalogs and no one was setting logos. You would have instances where you could have these very large catalogs that had all the same logo repeated over and over and over again. So now Morpheus includes a logo builder. If you don't have a logo available, you can just go ahead and create one, and let me show you how that works. So if I select the default logo there, and let's say that I was going to call this Ubuntu, you'll see that as I start to type in the word, Morpheus is going to use the name of the catalog item, or the name that you enter here, as a seed value. And the seed value is going to change the pattern, and it's also going to change the color of the shape itself. And if you don't like how that turns out, you can actually go in here and put in whatever seed value that you want, and when you're happy with it, you can leave it at that, and it'll give you some additional tools as well. We can make the word Ubuntu larger and smaller. We can change the font. Maybe we want it to be the words to be in red. You have lots of different controls here over the look and feel of the logo itself, But once you're happy with that, then you can save your changes and you will have your own custom logo to go with your new catalog item. So with everything configured, let's take a look at the final outcome. So I'm going to close my catalog item modal, and I'm going to go to the provisioning catalog. This is where the catalog items themselves can be provisioned for users within the standard persona, or some users who only see the provisioning catalog may see a similar screen every time that they log in. But let's take a look at the catalog item that we just created. That is this one. If I click the order button, you'll see the results of the work that we've just done. So over here is any documentation content you might have written. Didn't do a lot with this in creating this catalog item, but you can actually make some very rich documentation. It supports full markdown, so you can have headings, you can have smaller body copy, you can have images, you can have hyperlinks, you can have anything that you can do with markdown you can put here, and that will guide your users through the configuration process of what they're filling in over here. So a lot that you can do with this documentation content, just didn't happen to do that with this example. But let's take a look at how our form itself is actually going to work, and you're going to see how these fields that can reload and refilter based on each other are going to work for you without having to do any of that configuration ourselves. We get all of that for free just by using a form. So let's go ahead and select a different group. I'm going to choose my Amazon group, and that automatically reloaded this cloud. In this case, there's really only one cloud that I can select in there, so that automatically selected the one that was in there. My resource pools reloaded, and you can see that now I only have correct resource pools for my Amazon cloud. My versions and layouts have reloaded as well, and those are correct. I'm getting my Amazon VM layout. That's what I want. My plans are correct. These are the appropriate EC2 instance plans that we should see with an Amazon cloud. I have my correct network, and I have my correct disk as well. I do also want to point out these network and disk fields. They weren't fully loaded in the form builder, but now that we are in the catalog item itself, you can see that these aren't just basic text fields. These are the full network field and disk field, just like we would see in the instance provisioning wizard. I can add as many networks as I need to, just like I can in the instance configuration wizard. Same thing with disk. I can have, my root disk and multiple additional disks. I can set the size on all of those. It gives me the same configuration I would have setting up network and disk within the provisioning wizard, but I didn't have to do anything special by either creating lots of inputs or doing something special in order to get this to work. This will just work, and whatever I put in here is automatically going to be auto-injected into the instance map that we saw when we were creating the catalog item without me having to do anything special. Morpheus is just going to automatically inject those in for me, and it's going to work. We also see that this additional field group here for the tagging configuration, that was hidden by default, exactly like we configured, and the user could add as many additional tags as she or he wished when they were filling out this form. So as you can see, there's a lot of advantages to using forms when creating the catalog items. You get a lot of things for free that you would have had to build in yourself if you were creating a catalog item using inputs, and this just makes a lot of things much easier, especially when you want to have very dynamic catalog items that allow the users to have lots of options that are codependent on each other depending on what was selected in previous fields. So thank you for taking a look at forms with me today. If you've yet to upgrade to 6.1.0, you'll need to do that in order to see this forms feature. If you have never used Morpheus, you can download the the lab version of the Morpheus for free. That is going to be a time unlimited version of Morpheus that essentially gives you the complete feature set with very few limitations. The main limitations are just that it limits you to a small number of workloads that you can manage on a lab license. But as far as features, it opens up all the features to you. You can play around with forms and lots of the other features that are there, and give Morpheus a test drive for yourself in your home lab. Thank you.